Hello friends. On the afternoon of April 28, 1988, around 1 p.m., the passengers of Aloha Airlines Flight 243 were preparing for their short journey from Hilo to Honolulu. The weather was nothing short of beautiful, a perfect day for a flight. Most of the passengers were probably excited to embark on their vacation, looking forward to the picturesque beaches and lush landscapes that Hawaii is famous for. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Hawaii, let me take a moment to tell you about this remarkable place. Hawaii is a group of islands located in the Pacific Ocean, and it is an official state of the United States. It is known for its tropical climate, stunning scenery, and its capital, Honolulu. The flight in question was traveling from Hilo, the southernmost city on the big island of Hawaii, to Honolulu on the island of Oahu. The distance between these two cities was not great, just a 35-minute flight. In fact, this was a routine trip for Aloha Airlines, which primarily operates inter-island flights. Interestingly, the aircraft used for this flight, a Boeing 737, had already completed 8 flights that same morning. It had undertaken 3 round trips before carrying the passengers to Honolulu. However, this wasn't an unusual occurrence, as the 737s operated regularly on short routes in Hawaii. Passengers boarded the plane, and as the doors closed, the flight took off precisely at 1:25 p.m. But there was something peculiar that most people overlooked. One of the passengers, just before boarding, noticed something that would later prove to be crucial. As she was stepping onto the plane, she observed a small crack in one of the riveted metal sheets on the exterior of the aircraft. But, thinking it was insignificant and assuming the plane was regularly inspected, she didn't mention it to anyone. After all, this was a reputable airline, and the plane had been flying frequently without incident. No one could have known that this small crack would eventually lead to a series of events that no one could have anticipated. About 10 to 15 minutes after takeoff, as the flight attendants began serving drinks to the passengers, everything seemed to be normal. The seatbelt sign remained on, as is customary until the plane reaches its cruising altitude of 24,000 feet. At this altitude, the flight attendants began moving through the aisles, offering drinks. Everything was calm, and passengers were starting to relax and enjoy their flight. But then, just 20 minutes into the flight, something catastrophic happened. As the plane reached its cruising altitude, there was a deafening explosion, followed by a rapid decompression of the cabin. The noise was so loud that it startled everyone, and confusion ensued. The force of the decompression was so strong that it sent items flying around the cabin, and many passengers were struggling to breathe. Chaos and panic set in as people realized that something was terribly wrong. As the cabin pressure dropped dramatically, the situation became more desperate. The passengers looked around and were horrified to see that the roof of the aircraft, along with a significant portion of the walls, had been torn away. They could see the open sky above them. The front part of the fuselage, about 35 square meters, had been ripped apart, leaving a gaping hole in the plane's body. At an altitude of 24,000 feet, the outside air pressure is so low that without pressurization, human beings cannot breathe normally. Aircraft cabins are pressurized to ensure that the air remains breathable for passengers. Typically, if there is a loss of cabin pressure, oxygen masks would fall from the overhead compartments. These masks are designed to provide oxygen for about 15 to 20 minutes, giving the pilots enough time to descend to an altitude where passengers can breathe normally below 10,000 feet. However, in this case, the oxygen masks did drop, but they were useless. Due to the severe damage to the roof, the system that delivered oxygen to the masks had been destroyed. Panic spread as passengers began to experience dizziness, disorientation, and difficulty breathing. In just a few minutes, they could lose consciousness due to hypoxia when the body does not receive enough oxygen to function properly. One of the flight attendants, Michelle Honda, was near row 15 when the explosion occurred. She immediately tried to contact the cockpit via the intercom, but there was no response. Meanwhile, the other flight attendants, C.B. Lansing and Jane Sato, were both severely impacted by the explosion. Lansing, who had been serving a drink near row 5, was ejected from the plane, likely sucked out into the open air. Sato was near row 2 when she was struck by flying luggage, knocking her unconscious. The scene was one of utter panic, with passengers and crew alike struggling to comprehend the scale of the disaster. Despite this chaos, Michelle Honda continued her efforts to contact the cockpit, crawling along the aisle and asking passengers if anyone knew how to fly the plane. This only heightened the sense of fear and uncertainty among the passengers, who now feared for their lives, wondering whether the pilots had survived the disaster. Michelle eventually made it to the cockpit area, but the view was obstructed by debris. At this point, the situation seemed almost hopeless. There were only a few precious minutes before the lack of oxygen would render everyone unconscious, or worse. As if the situation weren't perilous enough, the passengers were also battling gale force winds, gusting at nearly 500 kilometers per hour. With the plane's roof missing, the inside was exposed to the brutal elements. The temperature outside the plane at 24,000 feet was around minus 45 degrees Celsius, and the passengers, most of whom were wearing tropical clothing like shorts and t-shirts, were now fighting against freezing cold air. Hypothermia was a real threat, and survival seemed increasingly unlikely. However, There was a silver lining amid the chaos. The pilots of the plane, Captain Robert Schornstheimer and First Officer Mimi, were alive and, remarkably, in better shape than the passengers. Both pilots were equipped with oxygen masks that were still functioning, providing them with the vital oxygen they needed. Upon realizing the extent of the damage to the plane, the pilots quickly took action. Captain Schornstheimer, a 44-year-old experienced pilot with Aloha Airlines, and First Officer Tompkins, who was to assess the situation, and began working together. They knew that they needed to act fast if they were going to save the passengers and themselves. The first priority was to descend as quickly as possible to a lower altitude, where they could breathe without the aid of oxygen masks. The pilots executed a rapid emergency descent, diving at speeds up to 500 kilometers per hour, dropping at an alarming rate of 4,100 feet per minute. Despite the urgency, they had another problem to deal with. The plane's nose had started drooping slightly just by about a meter, but this posed a serious risk. The structural integrity of the aircraft was compromised, and they feared that continued flight could cause the plane to break apart entirely. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, First Officer Tompkins had already contacted the Honolulu Air Traffic Control Tower. They were advised to land the plane at Maui, as it was closer than Honolulu. At 1:48 p.m., just 3 minutes after the explosion, Tompkins contacted the Maui Tower, notifying them of the catastrophic situation and requesting all available emergency services be prepared. By this time, the plane had descended to 14,000 feet, making it easier for the passengers to breathe and significantly reducing the risk of hypoxia. Still, the journey was far from over. As the pilots descended further to 10,000 feet, a new challenge arose. A massive mountain, the Halikala summit, stood directly in the plane's path. The pilots, however, maintained their composure and gradually slowed the plane down, reducing their speed from 210 knots to 170 knots. They carefully navigated the plane through a narrow gap between two islands, avoiding the mountain and making their way toward the airport. The passengers, now beginning to grasp the gravity of the situation, realized that the pilots were still in control of the plane. They were not only alive, but they were also expertly guiding the aircraft through what seemed like an impossible crisis. As the plane approached the runway, the landing gear was deployed. While the main gear released successfully, there was a problem with the nose gear. It would not extend properly. Normally in this situation, a belly landing could be performed, landing the plane on its underside without the nose gear. But given the extreme damage to the plane's fuselage and the possibility of further structural failure, the pilots knew this was too dangerous. A belly landing could result in an explosion if the fuel tanks were compromised. The pilots had no choice but to attempt a landing with the remaining gear. As the plane descended toward the runway, the situation became even more dire. The left engine failed, and attempts to restart it were unsuccessful. The emergency services had already assembled on the runway, preparing for the worst. Despite the mounting challenges, the pilots continued their descent, focusing on keeping the aircraft stable and ensuring that it would reach the runway safely. At 1:58 p.m., precisely 13 minutes and 42 seconds after the explosion, Aloha Airlines Flight 243 touched down on the runway. Thanks to the pilot's skillful handling and the quick response of the emergency teams on the ground, the plane came to a stop safely. The passengers were evacuated through emergency exits, and everyone was grateful to be alive. There was a real sense of relief as they slid down the emergency chutes, with many passengers offering their heartfelt thanks to the pilots for their extraordinary efforts. Although most of the passengers survived, many were injured. An 84-year-old woman, seated in row 5A, sustained a skull fracture and was among the most seriously injured. Several other passengers in rows 4 to 7 also sustained significant injuries. The crew members, too, faced severe challenges. Jane Sutter remained unconscious, while Michelle Honda was unharmed but worked to ensure the safety of the passengers. Tragically, C.B. Lansing, the flight attendant who had been ejected from the plane, was never found. She was the only fatality from the incident. The investigation that followed revealed that Aloha Airlines maintenance protocols were not up to par. The airline had failed to properly inspect the plane for cracks, despite warnings from Boeing about the aging aircraft and the potential risks involved. The NTSB's final report highlighted several issues, including the airline's lack of effective oversight and inadequate inspection methods. In the wake of this harrowing incident, the aviation industry made significant changes. New inspection methods, such as the use of eddy current and ultrasonic testing, were implemented to detect cracks in aircraft more effectively. Furthermore, the FAA introduced stricter regulations on the inspection of aging aircraft, ensuring that the lessons learned from Aloha Airlines Flight 243 would not be forgotten. This tragic yet miraculous event serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of safety and diligence in aviation. Since then, standards have been tightened, and countless lives have been saved due to the improvements made in aircraft maintenance and safety procedures. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of the most miraculous survival stories in aviation history. If you enjoyed this video and want to hear more incredible stories, don't forget to subscribe to The Secret Tailies for more hidden mysteries and fascinating tailies. Hit the bell icon to stay updated with our latest videos.